that I am very thankful that a conference like this, not just that a conference like this is happening and exists, but that this topic is being discussed in such an open format and very honest way by Dr. McKinney. Because as a African-American male, as an African-American male in a predominant African-American family, neighborhood, so on and so forth, my experience with suicide and all of the language and feelings that go along with it, it's made me very sensitive to this topic and this conversation. And so I don't want to make this about myself. I would love to share this and then ask you all, as we wait for our presentation to begin, what, if any, experiences, individuals you may know, anything around the thoughts within this topic. Because I know when I grew up, it was not something that was even mentioned, let alone talked about or thought about. In my reflections back to my youth, I can remember the times when, suicide was either a part of my environment. It was something that involved family members or friends, but because I was so insulated by my community and, in a big sense, the fear, not just stigma, but the fear of talking about it was very strong. And in so many ways, that was a disadvantage. And at the same time, it has created an event such as this and a topic and presenters such as Ms. McKinney that really speak to the experience of African Americans, not just in Central Texas, but across this country. Here we go. We have, we have someone in here. Oh, look at this. Someone from my home city, Philadelphia. Great. So some of the things that I've heard shared about COVID-19 right now and what we're doing to, move through it, not even really move, but more maneuver through it and all the complications, has been everything from simply going out to take a walk. And actually, I'm going to step back from that simply statement because going out to take a walk has so much relevance and importance even outside of the pandemic times right now in getting us that refresh and that reset. And so to remember simple things like that, and there we go. In that case, the idea of stepping out, it is relatively simple, but we also know that in the world today and the climate of our country, that is not exactly the easiest thing to do for members of the African American community. So I'm very thankful that I get reminded of simple tasks like this because I'm so up here and figuring out the most complicated ways I'm going to rearrange my space. I'm going to make sure that I have different areas of the house for different tasks. I'm going to make sure I get up and do this, newly scheduled routine. They're amazing, especially for someone like myself with a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so within that, simply going out for a walk is amazing. Here we go. Now, we're going to proceed with our presentation. But before we get started, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor for this session, the University of Texas at Austin. We are grateful for their support in helping make this event possible. Now, we have a few housekeeping items to go over together. First, this is a safe and supportive space. So please help us maintain a respectful and inclusive environment. Please keep yourself on mute at all times and remember that we are live on Facebook. Please use the chat function in Whova to interact with other attendees. For questions for the presenter, use the Q&A function in Whova. Now, if you feel overwhelmed or need to talk to someone during this session, please call 512-472-4357. That's 472-4357. Press 1 and then 1 again for immediate emotional support. And between sessions, you can visit our Comfort Suite, where we provide a safe haven. You'll find the Comfort Suite in Community under the main navigation in Whova. We have a number of surveys also. If you registered for a continuing education credit, or CEU, please check the chat for links. The first link will sign you in for your CEU, and please sign in at the beginning of the session. After the workshop, there will be another link for CEU evaluations. Please click on that link for a short evaluation, which also includes the CEU request form. Once you've completed the evaluation, you'll be taken to a page with a link to your CEU certificate. And we'll also post a link for the workshop evaluation in the chat. I also need to let you know that we have some amazing conference merchandise, so please be sure to check out our online store at ctaafsc.com/shop. Now, please join me in welcoming our presenter, WyKisha McKinney. WyKisha's fight against suicide began with the loss of her brother, who died by suicide in 2004. Overwhelmed by grief, she slipped into major depression, which almost ended with her own suicide attempt. With the support of her family and the help of local counseling centers, she was able to get the help she needed. She also found hope and recovery in serving others who had also been affected by suicide. WyKisha is the Zero Suicide Program Manager for the Harris Center for Mental Health and IDD in Houston, Texas, and the board chair of the Southeast Texas chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. She recently launched the Twin Tea Company, a tea company that donates 20% of its profits to suicide prevention. Now, in a moment, let's all enjoy the presentation, and we'll come back afterward for a live Q&A.
Thank you. Again, my name is WyKisha McKinney, and I am really excited to be here at the Central Texas African American Family Support Conference today. Today, we are going to talk about the aftermath, the impact of suicide, and the importance of postvention care. Before we begin, I'd like to set a baseline for shared language on the topic. We avoid using the phrase committed suicide as it can have a negative connotation, and instead we encourage the die by suicide, ended their life, or killed themselves. We also avoid using terms like failed or successful attempt, as this implies judgment. Instead, we use or we encourage the use of phrases such as suicide attempt or suicide or death by suicide. Educating the public about suicide is critical for encouraging help seekers, raising awareness of risk in vulnerable populations, and advocating for new interventions and prevention strategies for those at risk. When suicide is talked about safely and accurately, we can help reduce the likelihood of its occurrence. In this presentation today, we will discuss the impact of a suicide on individuals, families, and the community. We'll talk about the grief and bereavement experience of loss survivors, and specifically the unique factors in the bereavement of Black and African American loss survivors. We'll also discuss
Audience, we apologize for the technical difficulties we're experiencing right now. We are working behind the scenes to make sure that this is resolved as soon as possible. Please wait for us, and thank you for your patience.
of Black and African American loss survivors. We'll also discuss the importance of postvention care and its role in suicide prevention. And I will share some information on postvention best practices. And we'll close today with some tools and resources that you can use to learn more about suicide and postvention care, and maybe to launch some projects programs in your communities to help those who are bereaved by suicide. But to begin, I'd like to share a little story with you. My family moved from our small apartment in South Dallas to the suburban area of Mesquite. Mesquite was very different from South Dallas. The homes were newer and bigger, and the streets were quieter, and my neighbors were whiter. In fact, moving to this area would mean the time that I would ever have white neighbors, friends, and classmates. At my new school, there were very few kids that looked like me. And as I moved into more advanced placement programs, those familiar faces were even fewer and further between. And as I reflect back on the past 16 years as a loss survivor, I'm taking back to the time of going to a new school and having the new kid feeling. If you've ever been a new kid in school, you know the feeling I'm talking about. It's the feeling you get walking into a classroom for the first time and all eyes are on you as folks are trying to size you up and figure you out. It's the feeling of walking into the cafeteria, scanning the room for a friendly face and an invitation to sit at their table. That's the feeling I got when I walked into my first SOS group and when I went into my first suicide prevention conference. I walked into the room and quickly realized that one of these things is not like the others. And while I have connected with some awesome people and feel and have built some beautiful relationships with those who shared in my loss experience, I often long to see more of my own reflection in the crowds. The impact of suicide. In 2019, 47,511 Americans died by suicide. That's one person every 11.1 minutes. And one study estimated that for every one suicide, about 105 people are exposed, with 1 in 5 reporting that this experience had a devastating impact or caused a major life disruption. The number of survivors of suicide loss in the US is more than 5.4 million, one of every 60 Americans. So these are survivors of suicide loss, which includes myself and includes many more, as we can see from these statistics. Everyone grieves differently. Some people may experience short-term reactions, while others may have long-term responses. Exposure to suicide can lead to an array of negative outcomes, including mental health issues, social isolation, and an increased risk of suicide. I, as a survivor of suicide loss, can definitely share in the experience of the loss and grief process after my brother passed away. And can definitely talk about how it created the major life disruption and the challenges that I had. Following his death, I struggled with major depression, and I also struggled with traumatic stress and anxiety. Fortunately, I've been able to get help and receive the support I needed to be well and manage myself and my mental well-being in a more positive way. So, but to begin though, I'd like to share where my journey began as a survivor of suicide loss. I'm going to share a video. I'm going to share a video from a documentary called Life Journey, Reclaiming Life After Suicide Loss, that was produced by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Let's watch.
My brother Johnny was quite intelligent. He cared about and just was a bleeding heart for folks who needed help. People enjoyed his company. He had lots of friends, a social butterfly. He was a handsome guy and he knew it. And he was excited about being an uncle. He was very close to my son and he loved him dearly. Johnny was gay. He came out to me first and mostly because I asked. I didn't have to ask, but I wanted to hear it from him. Johnny tested positive for HIV. His health had definitely started to decline. He was taking more medication. He had been in and out of the hospital several times. I remember him describing several times that he started to look sick. He started to grieve his own life. The idea of living sick and someone having to take care of him and someone having to attend to him was just a life that he didn't want to live.
So that's where my story starts, with this guy, Johnny Madison. That is my brother. And for as long as I remember, he had a special way of nudging me into some pretty pivotal moments of my life. He was there for my first date, in which he encouraged me to ask the guy out and then proceeded to make all the preparations for the perfect date for two scared and awkward, shy 13-year-old kids. Then there was a time he convinced me to join the high school drill team or to try out for the high school drill team, despite the fact that I had never done a high kick or a split in my entire life. He was right there preparing me and coaching me for tryouts. And much to my disbelief, I actually made the team. Prior to becoming a belle and joining the dance team, I was a bit of a tomboy. I was in jeans and tennis shoes most of the time and t-shirts. I loved baseball caps. So to then have to put on makeup and walk around in tights and petticoats and do all of these things in front of hundreds of people was completely out of my comfort zone. And then if you notice at this picture, the uniform looks like a Christmas tree. And what you don't see and what you can't hear is that the petticoat and the headband and the boots are all filled with bells. So as we walked the halls on game day, you couldn't do anything but call attention to yourself as you jingled everywhere you went. So it was definitely out of my comfort zone. And as awkward as it was initially, being a belle and being on the dance team was one of the most amazing experiences of my teen years. And I loved really being able to do that. And to this day, I am a belle for life and I still participate as an alumni and I still keep in contact with my fellow belles. Then there was a time where he stood with me when I had to tell my parents that I was expecting at 19 years old. He vowed to go toe-to-toe with anybody that had anything other than blessings and positive energy come my way while I carried that baby. And he would be there for me again and support me again when I decided to move to Houston and go back to school and raise my son as a single parent. Being an uncle was one of his proudest achievements. And although he died when my son was really young, Nick remembers him vividly to this day. And he shares those memories with his sister. On February 6, 2004, Johnny would nudge me one last time. His death by suicide would push me into what would become my life's work. Some of the most challenging times of my life stemmed from losing him. My experience as a loss survivor are what moved me to make an impact, influence change, and help those who have also been affected by suicide. In grief and bereavement and survivors of suicide loss, the experience is very unique and very different. The toughest time of my grief journey was the night after the funeral, when there was nothing left to do, nothing left to keep my mind occupied. This is an important time where help and support can be life-changing. And a quote that I made in that life journey video was, when the funeral is over and you say goodbye, and you say goodbye to everyone, and you go home and it's quiet, that's when the grief starts. The toughest times of my grief journey was the night after the funeral, when there was nothing left to do, nothing left to keep my mind occupied. This is an important time where help and support can be life-changing. Some of you may be familiar with the stages of grief, and you may even be familiar with this particular diagram. This image makes the stages of grief look very nice, neat, doesn't it? It makes it look like a smooth transition where you go from experiencing the loss, and then you have a bit of a slump, but then in 3 to 6 months or maybe a year, you end up adjusting to the loss and all is well. Everything is puppies and clouds again. But we know, for anyone who's experienced the stages of grief or experienced the loss, grief looks more like this. This is more like my experience as a survivor of suicide loss. It's a mess. You may go from shock to affirmations to hope to denial to emotional outbursts and then to new patterns and strengths, all in 20 to 30 minutes. And then you may even have days where you're feeling great. You're feeling new strengths and you're building new relationships and you hit another slump. It's not a nice, neat, clean experience, and the process is different for everyone. In this sense, the grief process for Black loss survivors is no different. We experience the same shock and numbness as everyone else, as well as the guilt and the loneliness and anger. And at some point, we arrive to new patterns and hope and new relationships. And at some point, we arrive to new patterns, new relationships, and hope. What is different for what is unique is that new kid feeling I was telling you about.
As an African American, who do I go to say my brother killed himself when this isn't a conversation that Black people have? For some African Americans, if you are depressed, it's not your mental illness, that's a lack of faith. You need to go to church and pray on it. After Johnny died, a family member said that he died because we didn't love him.
The new kid feeling comes from the myth that Black people don't die by suicide. This horrible myth was one of the first things I heard as a new survivor of suicide loss from someone that was supposed to be able to help me. It immediately gave me the message that I, my brother, and my family were odd in some way, were different. This added to the feelings of hopelessness and isolation that contributed to my complicated grief and major depression. Another contributor is the lack of research on suicide in Black communities. The months immediately following Johnny's death are, for the most part, a blur to me. What I do remember is struggling to find answers to the why. I would spend hours online trying to find as much information as I possibly could. And let me tell you, Google in 2004 was nowhere near what it is today. My research often left me feeling even more isolated and even more odd because it usually turned up pictures of famous white people that died by suicide,
outdated articles, and statistics that said it was rare for Black people to kill themselves, if we were mentioned at all. And I believe that there have, and I do believe that there have been some improvements on research, and I do believe there have been some improvements in the research on suicide in Black communities. But I also feel that we're so far behind the mark on this that we've positioned ourselves to fight an uphill battle that is confirmed, and this is confirmed by alarming increases in Black youth suicide. Recent studies have shown that suicide attempts by Black teens rose 73% from 1991 to 2017. And the suicide rate amongst Black children ages 5 to 11 is rising faster than any other ethnic group. We've got work to do. Another contributor to the new kid feeling is the lack of representation. So the lack of representations, or the lack of representation of African Americans in this realm of work. I'm sure many of you know the importance of representation, and not being able to see a face that looks like mine is a barrier to receiving care. From faces on flyers to top level decision makers, we still have a predominantly white, non-people of color image of suicide. And as the statistics that I mentioned to you earlier show, the face of suicide is changing. So how can we effectively serve a people that we don't even invite to the table? Next, the limited amount of Black mental health professionals, or even just postvention support for Black survivors, speaks to the problem with representation. In 2004, SOS groups were scarce, and not one had a Black face except my own. Today, there are many more groups in the Houston area, but very few have any persons of color. And in a city that is supposed to be the most diverse in the country, we have no bilingual groups. Next is the pressure to code switch. From a linguistic perspective, code switching is the ability to alternate between two or more languages. Like if you're bilingual and you can switch between speaking English and Spanish, or a mix between the two. From a cultural perspective, particularly in Black culture, code switching is also a survival tactic. We become like a chameleon, changing the way we talk and behave, sometimes even the way we dress and wear our hair to blend in with white culture. The challenge with code switching is that as a loss survivor, it's difficult for me to open up for the support and care that I need in an environment where I feel like I can't be my authentic self. Next is microaggressions or micro insults. Microaggressions are defined as brief, everyday exchanges that include demeaning messages to certain individuals because of their group or membership. The person making these comments may be otherwise well-intentioned and unaware of the potential impact of their words. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, I was building an outreach program in a very rural part of East Texas. I had a meeting with a woman who was white that was a part of an organization we were considering developing partnership with. I asked her to give me the lay of the land, who the gatekeepers are, who the movers and shakers were, who I needed to be meeting with in order to get this program off the ground. She said to me, well, they call this area behind the pine curtain, and we do things different behind the pine curtain. Most folks are really conservative and traditional here and tend to stick with their own social groups. You might do better with getting your boss, who was a white man, to talk to these folks. Then she referred to me as girlfriend, popped her neck, and then said stuff like, I guess Black don't crack, and I have Black friends over for dinner all the time. Well-meaning, perhaps. However, it was very offensive and unprofessional to assume that I couldn't hold my own in a professional setting. And it was absolutely offensive for her to assume that she could address me so unprofessionally in a business meeting, or so casually in a business meeting. As a loss survivor, I've heard many rude comments from well-meaning people, Black and white, that made me feel even more isolated and very untrusting of the people around me. There have been times where I found myself facing questions and comments like, was your father in your lives? Or where's your dad? Does he know your brother's dead? Speaking to the stigma that Black fathers aren't present in our lives. I've heard comments like, Black women are so strong, you can't possibly be depressed. Again, giving into the stereotype that the strong Black woman is resilient and can endure all. Finally, the current racial climate in our country is a problem for many reasons. The divisiveness created by racial tensions and anger and hatred that in our country right now can deter those affected by suicide from out for help. The reality is we cannot have a true conversation about Black suicide and suicide prevention or even suicide postvention without discussing systemic racism and social injustices. Because these are the things that create the hopelessness and helplessness and the feeling of loss that someone considering suicide may experience. Postvention care. So postvention care, we've talked about the experience of a survivor of suicide loss, and we've talked about those specific kind of factors that play a role in the grief process for Black survivors of suicide. Now I'd like to share with you a little bit about postvention care. And for me, postvention care played a major role in my recovery and my healing process, but also it played a major role in the motivation for me to get involved and provide more support to those affected by suicide. Postvention is an organized response in the aftermath of a suicide to accomplish any one of the following: to facilitate the healing of individuals from the grief and distress of suicide, to mitigate other negative effects of exposure to suicide, like post-traumatic stress, major depression, or complicated grief, and to prevent the suicide among people who are at high risk after the exposure. According to the Suicide Prevention and Resource Center, all settings should incorporate postvention as a component of a comprehensive approach to suicide prevention. In essence, postvention is prevention. It fosters connectedness and belonging, which is a key factor against suicide. It offers support after a major loss and aids in breaking down helps in breaking down the stigma associated with suicide. And it also offers opportunities for awareness and education. The good and bad of postvention care and awareness and education is that I'm often called to workplaces or schools or different communities after a suicide has taken place for education. While I would love for these environments to be more proactive as opposed to reactive, I do take advantage of the opportunity to educate this community so that we can prevent any further suicides. The National Action Alliance offers guidelines for responding to grief, trauma, and distress after a suicide. These are best practices that we could use to provide support and care to those who've been impacted by a loss. The first thing is coordinated, comprehensive community responses. More than likely, the caregivers whom bereaved interact with initially have almost no contact with one another. From and the medical personnel to clinicians or even the funeral home attendants, they don't interact or communicate with each other. When a suicide takes place, there are most likely going to be emergency personnel, EMTs, the fire department, the police department, the coroner. The bereaved deserve a consistent response, and first responders who are well-trained, knowledgeable, and compassionate in their approach to survivors can assist in their healing process. Also, our first responders may need assistance with their own grief and trauma reactions that result from this experience. Practical assistance is also important. Practical matters related to the death can include the cleaning and restoration of the death scene, handling the deceased personal effects, notification of family and friends, making funeral arrangements, or helping with travel and logistics.
It could also include making decisions about religious observances and dealing with the details related to the official investigations. Maybe even talking with the insurance company and settling financial matters. Support from social networks and communities, including digital communities, is also very useful and very helpful. Larger networks containing more people who try to help are perceived as more supportive and also are associated with less complicated grief outcomes for survivors. So the more support they have, the better. Proper training and preparations are sorely needed for all kinds of professionals and caregivers who regularly come into contact with the suicide bereaved beyond the first hours, days, and weeks of the death. Help from skilled mental health professionals and other service providers is another best practice. In addition to the support from the community and the social networks, having access to mental health care is helpful for the grief process, but also helps to prevent the potential risk for a suicide of a survivor's suicide loss. Highly trained professionals, of course, provide services such as psychopharmacology, psychotherapy, and family therapy. Peer support. Contact with others who've experienced a suicide loss can be extremely helpful, like the survivor suicide loss support groups that I mentioned to you all earlier in the presentation. This support should also include additional support for children and teens whose grief process is a little bit different from that of adults and they need some very unique skills and some unique support unique to their peer group. And then finally, family support. A family-oriented approach to suicide bereavement shows great promise in helping to mitigate these sometimes damaging and long-lasting effects of suicide. You can learn more about these guidelines and these best practices, again, in the Responding to Grief and Trauma and Distress After a Suicide in the national guidelines. Finally, I want to offer you all some tools and resources that you could look to for additional information. As I mentioned a couple of times, the U.S. national guidelines are very helpful. In addition to the best practices that they offer to us, they also have some links and connections to different toolkits and different resources that you could use to share with others. Another good resource is the Healing Conversations, a program with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. The Healing Conversations program offers personal support for survivors of suicide loss. Individuals can go to AFSP's website, which I have the link here, and submit their information, and a survivor of suicide loss will contact them and make connections and provide their peer-to-peer support with them. There's also a SOS handbook that provides those practical tips and tools for postvention care. So the handbook would actually be a great place to look for practical resources on how to handle the funeral, the financial planning after the death, how to talk with the life insurance companies. And finally, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Of course, if anyone is ever in a crisis, they can contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. And they can also go to the website to find some additional resources for postvention care. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to participate in today's presentation and in the conference, and I'm happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
Hello again, everybody. Now, unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, we are unable to have WyKisha come in and answer any questions you may have. But also, we have here an opportunity for an open discussion about this. And thankfully, I am joined by my good friend, Vicki Coffey from the Hall Foundation. Vicki?
Hi, Elliot. I'm so glad I could step in.
Yeah, thank you for being here, especially because I know you understand the importance of this topic and this conference. And so I willingly, and I genuinely do enjoy, right, talking about this topic as a person who, and I know the language we're looking at, I may, I may use incorrect terminology and such, but as a person who was not successful with their suicide attempt, 2 suicide attempts actually, I this speaks to me because being on the other side, like understanding what friends, family, not just my own, but how other people's would be affected by this. I don't know if that would have affected my my attempts. I don't know if it would have affected how I perceived myself before or afterwards. But what I do know is there are a lot of similarities that run between WyKisha's experience here in Texas and my own experience in Philadelphia, because there is more than just one Black experience. There is more than one just general experience within mental health. And so on that end, the concept of what could we have done, if I've heard it so many times when I talk about this, what could we have done? What could we have said? Or what should I do? What can I say when I have a family member or friend who is talking about these things? And the biggest piece that I give is there's literally no way to know. We can beat ourselves up over our loss, and it is completely justified. Everybody's feelings within the life of the person who was taken away from us so quickly and so suddenly, everyone's feelings matter in that. And what I'm trying to get across is that when we try to figure something out, it's like trying to put together a puzzle and you're missing at the very least half of the pieces. We can start to try to plug in different pieces of cardboard. We can draw on them to make them look like the photo, make them look like the entire puzzle. We can try to force pieces from other puzzles in there to make something look or feel right. And at the end of the day, if I had gone through, and I did go through with it, but I did not, like I said, have success in it, it would have been impossible for my friends and my family to know. I didn't even tell my mother and my father until much later in life. The 2 attempts were both in college. And my experience there, my experience at home within my community, this is something that you just did not talk about, mental health in general. And I know that for people who work within that mental health realm, and Vicky, I would love to get your thoughts on this. Seeing events like this has such a traumatic impact on the friends and families who have been affected by this. So yeah, I'd love to hear your opinions.
Sure. Let me first start by saying and just thanking God for your being successful in surviving. I think that's where we emphasize this success, right? Because people say you weren't successful at completing suicide. No, you were successful at staying alive. Just to reframe that and to say what a blessing, because we wouldn't have the knowledge and expertise, and we wouldn't just have the friendship that we have if you were not here. And so to me, that's very valuable. I think you, as a person who has survived, bring a wealth of knowledge, and you have chosen as your passion, proficiency, and positioning, I guess, from listening from our earlier session, to share your experiences candidly and transparently to help others. And so I think I don't know of a whole lot more things or other ways that you could do more to give of yourself. So I just want to personally say thank you. I think that's just an amazing sacrifice, because as we know, as Black people, we just would say nothing. What if you never told your parents? What if you never came out and shared with us? The impact that you could make would look so different. Not to mention that you wouldn't get the strength that I'm assuming that you draw from being candid and open about it. I mean, I don't think anyone hopefully has looked at you and said, what, well, it sure worked or whatever. No one's, I could see it being the complete opposite, like thank God or thank the universe or thank whoever you believe in that it didn't happen, because you're just such a rich spirit who's so passionate about this work. And so I'm very grateful for that. I'm going to try to not get emotional about that, but it's just awesome to me. As a clinician, and I'm not practicing, but having worked with people who at one point were feeling either like taking their own life or like life wasn't worth living, it's very hard as a person who considers themselves to be in that role, to be a helper, to be a mentor, to be a supporter, for you to sit with someone or even a loved one. It doesn't even have to be a professional. If you're anyone who cares about someone else who is considering taking their own life, it's a very hard seat to sit in, because you can feel so helpless. And it just, no matter what you do, chances are you take responsibility for that. I mean, and the key point takeaway from this is that I heard you say is pretty much nothing anyone else said. There were no signals necessarily that you shared that, you know, your parents didn't even know because you were in college. They couldn't have done anything about it. But I think the tremendous amount of guilt that we feel, because if you love someone, you want to help. And so I don't know if I answered that question. I felt a little bit like I was rambling, but so I will move to a question that came into the chat. And that is, do you think cultural relevance can be trained regarding support for suicide survivors? Or I'd say suicide.
Okay. So my immediate reaction to that question would be no. But that hardness of that no comes from a space of, you cannot train anybody, any human, to fully comprehend the experiences and how to communicate, how to, you know, basically understand like what's going on in someone else's mind. There's no way that even Vicky, you and I speaking together right now, you could be telling me that you feel one way. And I mean, we do this sadly in our professions a good deal, any jobs, right? Teacher, custodian worker, anything. We can't be 100% sure that the person is saying exactly what they are feeling. So within the concept of training, I would say the focus of those is more of an awareness and a recognition that there are roadblocks, there are impediments to understanding what another person of another culture is experiencing. And so how do you respect and value and honor those experiences within the conversation around topics such as this? Because one of the things is, again, depending on where you're from, the experience is going to be different. Depending on the history of the person, it's going to be different. And I know that within myself, the idea of and WyKisha put this very, very perfectly. I just want to make sure I look at this correctly. Let's see. Yes, so yes. So in regard to like being someone who is supporting someone who was not successful or was successful in surviving, it's more just be quiet, listen, don't ask leading questions. Because when I did start talking about this, one of the first times was when I was teaching high school back in Philly. And I've always been very open and honest with regard to mental health, especially with young people, because one of the issues that is bringing this, topic to the forefront is the fact this is not talked about. And I worked and taught in a school that was about 98 to 99% Black population. And so these kids were in no way, shape, or form used to hearing about these things. But when the topic came up unintentionally, the level of what? There's someone who has actually experienced this, who looks like me, who is facing, relatively similar social expectations, so on and so forth. And when they would ask questions, I use that as an opportunity to say, see, we don't want to ask questions that judge the person who you are asking them of. So that within that training, within that aspect of a potential training, yes, you can train somebody on that. You know to not say, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. It's not about what you don't say. It's about either A, what you do say, or B, how you respond. And those responses, really, dead face. Because the second that we start showing our emotions or shock or awe, really, what? That is already speaking volumes. Even though it's genuine and not coming from a negative, hurtful space, our body language says to a person if we accept what they're saying, and if that person is speaking in code switching, right? If a person is code switching and you have zero idea how to comprehend that, it's okay. Because at the end of the day, the person is sharing their experience. So on that training end, it's not about training on it's not about training to get across the idea of cultural sensitivity and cultural relevance. It's more so to understand the components behind why there might be difficulty within that community and talking about it. That is more of the education that, as someone who was successful in surviving, would put out there. And I saw we had a hand raised. I want to make sure that person gets a chance.
Thank you, Elliot. And I'm hoping someone else will take care of that hand raise thing, because I'm not sure how to fix that feature. I know we have our wonderful Zoom techs in the background working on that.
I can tell you it was raised and they took it down. So there's no hand raised at the moment.
Thank you so much. Who is that Zoom tech person? Justin?
That's my man, Justin.
Thank you.
Justin is your Zoom tech.
Thank you so much, Justin. Just hit us up if the person raises their hand again. So we had a comment from Minister Hosey, and she said, as a minister, helping others is tough. And again, we can, as African Americans, Black people, we cannot minimize the role of our faith community or our faith leaders. And so I don't know, Minister Hosey, if you feel comfortable unmuting your phone, but you put in the chat that someone has talked with you and come and talked to you about their intentions to take their own life, and how all you could do was listening and how overwhelming that was for you. I know oftentimes our clergy are not equipped to know how to support someone who is experiencing this. And it's more times than not, there's a lot of stigma associated with taking one's own life, particularly in Black communities and in the Christian faith community. And so all of the controversy and all of the stigma tied around that can make it very shaming for someone to go to their minister and share that they are experiencing either a serious mental health crisis and needing extra support, or thinking about taking their own lives. So I would think by the time someone came to their pastor and said, I am thinking about taking my own life, that is a huge step for someone to do that. It says a lot about their confidence and their relationship with their pastor, but also to me, that is such a ripe opportunity for support. And so I think as a community, and we've tried with this conference for many years to equip our faith leaders with the skills to know how to identify, how to recognize signs and symptoms if they are presented to them, and also what to do to refer out, because our clergy members, they are not the experts in everything. And people come to them in pain. Places of worship are often seen as that refuge house or place where people can go to be healed and be well. And if they get there and they get a clergy member that either is like, oh, you just need to pray, girl, get the Satan, devil's in you, that can be very off-putting. However, it is also very common. And I think that WyKisha talked about that in the video as well. And so Minister Hosey is going to join us, it looks like shortly, via her phone, if that can work. But she could also, couldn't she just raise her hand, and then you could put her on through her phone as well? And while you guys are working that magic behind the scenes, let us know when she comes on board, and then we'll bring her in to have a conversation about that. Definitely.
And Vicki, that's also to make sure I want to honor and value our faith community leaders because of things like that, like taking in this information, taking in somebody's story, especially along the lines of this topic, is very, very overwhelming, and they're already in tune and in touch with their community. And so to ask our, again, faith leaders to be able to be our therapist as well as our confidants, as well as a family member, as well as so many things, it's difficult. And just on the topic, that is exactly why, and I'll say this, exactly why I joined the current organization that I'm with, the D. Wood Foundation. At the D. Wood Foundation, our entire mission is to raise awareness for suicide prevention and advocate for mental health reform in minority communities. And that speaks volumes to my experience. And so when I met our founder, Fabian Wood, we just had an instant conversation and feeling of camaraderie. And I'm not going to share his story because I'll let him. I don't want to share somebody else's story along these lines, but what I can say is the well of experiences and feelings that come up in this conversation, the idea of trying to expect all of our leaders, anybody, parent, loved one, friend, faith leader, having the idea that they should have all the answers puts an undue pressure on them, and it's what causes a lot of us to not want to talk about it. It causes individuals to say, no, I mean, I already know this is overwhelming. I haven't heard anything from these people in my life, so therefore they must not think about it either. Maybe they don't have the experience, when really those individuals in our lives are, maneuvering between their own pain. Maybe they have family and other friends, or even just colleagues that have had this experience, and they are scared to talk about it. You have the idea that not everybody has had suicide prevention training. Again, that word training meaning that there's still another human on the other end. So even within training, it's difficult to try to put that into practice. And so with me and Vicky, thank you for speaking on my, hiding it from my parents, because that was the other thing. Sometimes, hell, I'd even say most often not, no one around the person knows, because there's a difference between coming out and speaking on it and basically announcing that that is the intention or that is my desire, and the fear of even saying anything and just closing myself off. The first attempt was going through a phase of depression, and I did not leave my dorm room for about 2-3 straight days at all. And I'm not saying this to overemphasize a point, but it's the truth. Nobody knew. And I was very loud, fun, vivacious kind of person. I was in all the groups and all the clubs and so on and so forth. But then when I retreated, it was very easy to say, okay, how do I deflect from my ability? How do I deflect from all the eyes and ears now who are curious about me? Oh, just be louder, be more fun, be more of a mask. So thank you again. Thank you for saying that, because it wasn't until I saw my fifth therapist that I really came to terms with what my actions were and how that affected me. But I can also say that as a child, I was very fortunate, especially as a Black child, to have seen a therapist since I was in 6th grade, since I was 12 years old. Because if I didn't have that, and which is why I try to stress so much within my work that children need to be recognized as little humans, not just little things that are innocent and that we need to protect from everything. No, children take in everything in their environment and then some. So even though we may want to tell ourselves that children aren't affected, or if we just, back away and not bring something up, it won't actually manifest in life, that's not the case.
That's right. Especially now. I mean, our kids are super smart, and they also have access to so much information, the good information, but also access to things that are not good for them to take into their little spirits. And so that is an excellent point, that we have to be mindful of our young children. And I jotted down something that WyKisha said, and she said that the rates of youth between the ages of 5 and 11 have been rising faster than any other group. And I think I was probably still eating dirt and making mud pies. I mean, kids don't do that anymore, but I was still playing with Barbie dolls and all those things that you think as a kid that you're supposed to do, and playing with trucks and riding bikes. And so for someone to have such a heavy load at such an early age, to me, when you talk about pain, that starts really early. But we also cannot forget that trauma starts very early. And so a natural reaction to trauma is wanting to end that pain, right? Or wanting to be separated from that trauma that's taking place. Mm-hmm. So Justin, I didn't see, I know that Minister Hosey was going to raise her hand. She wanted to make a comment. If you could click raise your hand, Sonia, that would be great. And then Justin can bring you into the conversation. We would love that.
There we go.
In the meantime, and cut us off when you get there, Sonia. And in the meantime, we had a question, and that was that teachers and faith leaders are expected to play such pivotal roles that they are not always equipped to handle. And that's kind of what we were just talking about. Even with the social unrest that our nation has endured recently, has increased the suicide rate among our African American community. Since communication is key, would you say that learning to love people where they are in life is just as important as mental health training?
Okay. So I put this. I want to just take a step back and think about that for a moment, because it is I think it's such an important question. And I do want to give Sonia her chance to also put her comment out there. And I have a good feeling that they are going to influence my answer no matter what.
Sonia, are you on yet? While we're waiting for Sonia to join us, if you notice in the chat, thanks Ann for reminding us that Integral Care offers mental health first aid. And it's a free training that gives people the tools they need to help someone showing signs of mental health issues or someone that may be experiencing a mental health crisis. And so it's a free training that's offered for the community. It is a commitment unless it's changed. I know, well, virtually that's a good point. Now the classes are being offered virtually. When it's in person, it's 2 full 8-hour days. I know because I'm a trainer, and those are some long days, let me tell you. So yes, that class is available. I know there is also a new initiative, and you'll hear about this tomorrow in our Central Texas awardees. Through Shoal Creek, they are looking to train faith-based leaders in mental health first aid as well. And so that will be something that's available for our faith community. NAMI Central Texas also offers faith communities free training for education and responses to mental health and crises through their Bridges to Hope. And there's going to be a course offered on 2/25, and there's a link in the chat. The Bridges to Hope is, just for your information, is one training that's focused for faith leaders who serve communities of color. And so if you see the link there, or even go to namicentraltexas.org, you will find information about the Bridges to Hope training. And to find information about the Integral Care training, you can go to their website. There's a link that's provided there. And again, organizations can even schedule a private training and get that for free as well. So, okay, we're looking for Minister Hosey. You ready to join us? Okay. So
That's the wonders of modern technology, right?
Yeah.
So please, Sonia, whenever you feel you can come in and your voice is working on the Zoom, please interrupt me. I will. So in response to the previous question, the idea within Western medicine about illness or sickness of any kind typically revolves around being reactive instead of proactive. We are right now within this conversation focusing on our reactions to suicide instead of, I mean, rightly so, we should be talking about this because after an event happens, we need to break it down. And at the same time, what about the things that were leading up to the person wanting to, try to take their own life? And then B, after this is done, after that situation has sadly occurred, now we're talking about how can we support the parent or support the loved one. And so there's two different answers. On the parent and support end, I'm sorry, not the parent, but on the person and the support end for those who are the loved ones of the person who has been lost, that is having them, I would say, honestly, I can't say what should be done with them because I am not that person. I am on the other side of the table. I don't want to be disingenuous with my answer. I do know that on my side of the table, when it comes to mental health and what led up to that, up to my attempt, was mitigated by my having a therapist, again, when I was 12 years old. It did not obviously stop what was going on. It didn't stop what I tried to do. But when I was successful in living and surviving, I then had an option that I was already well aware of and well versed in. I knew that there were people out there who would talk to me. And even though I did not have my first African-American therapist until I made it to Austin, I do know that the men and the women who did not share my skin shade still were pivotal in what I could do, what I could say, what I felt I had, the strength that I eventually built up. So we don't want to limit, but we do want to be aware of the individuals who are speaking with our young people Are they in tune with what is going on? Are they able to respect their experiences? Are they able to provide tools that also take into account their situations, their culture, but not making assumptions? Because I've never had a single therapist make an assumption about what I was experiencing, especially after I began talking with them with what happened. Sonia, are you back with us?
Now I'm muted. It looks like Tanya's having trouble with her audio. And so we're going to let her keep working on that. But one of the things that the question we had, and kind of going back to that, I wanted to touch on, and the question was, since communication is key, would you say that learning to love people where they are at in life is just as important as mental health training? And I would say, I believe it is, because honestly, one of the things to me that can be a challenging thing, especially for a young person, is learning to love themselves, for starters. Y'all remember when you're young and your hair ain't growing quite right, or you got a little bit too much weight on you, or you just feel like, something's wrong with you. And if you could just, we're all beautiful, right? We're all created in an image that is individual and unique to us, and we're all beautiful. But when you're in that ugly phase, that ugly age where you don't feel good about yourself and you don't feel right, it's easy to feel like people don't love you. And I think that that's critical, that yes, that you can love someone, not to the point that you're going to save their life necessarily, but you can love someone to the point that they feel like they're accepted. Because a lot of what happens with our young people is they just don't feel accepted. They feel like they're an outcast. Even if you are in the best of situations and your mental health as well, as a teen and a young person, that's just a tough age. And so I think love can play a big role in it. And I think just listening is the other thing, and allowing people to talk without feeling like you have to fix it, because we want to listen. And a lot of us that are on this call now and in this conference care about people. We are in this space either as work or as a caregiver or as an advocate because we care about other people, and we don't like seeing people in pain and hurt. And particularly as a parent, one of the toughest things to do is see your baby in pain and hurting. And so love is critical. I do think it's important, and it's underestimated a lot of time, the impact that love can have and the difference that it can make. So I think it's love, and I don't think it's just love. How people say, oh, those babies just need love. Yes, they need love, and so, and some of those resources, and some other things besides just that. It's not the only thing.
And Vicki, just to end on your note right there, because we only have about our 1 minute left before our time goes up. I am so thankful you just said that about love and what has to happen in addition to that, because I have made the argument that yes, love is important, obviously, but what does that love look like? What are the actions behind that love? Because for me, my parents, even though they didn't know, even when I came home from college and I was just in my room all day, their love for me was manifested in asking me how I was doing. Their love for me was bringing me dinner when they saw that I just wasn't leaving. Their love for me was, giving me a chance to drive the car and just, go out for a little bit, even though it was my dad's brand new Apple Red Buick. So, but they knew that something was going on, and their love informed that, and their love informed the action that they take and the resources they did provide, because that love also is what got me into therapy at a young age. And that love was what continued to get me into CA counselor and everything involved with that. When I was at that age of, oh, he's in college, he should be taking care of himself. So yeah, love, what does it look like? What action does it make us take? And how can we best apply that, and those lessons to the people that we love and care about, meeting them where they're at. So I just want to say, again, everyone, thank you for your time. Thank you for just this experience. I want to say thank you in extension to WyKisha for her sharing all of her knowledge and insight with us through that video. And again, out to all of you, your time and your appreciation of this space is why the world is going to continuously become a better place. So now please take a few minutes, complete the workshop survey. It helps us to know how we are doing. And if you're seeking those CEUs, remember that your forms will be in the survey. The links are in the chat. Thanks again, and be safe and well.
And I add also would be remiss without adding resources again, and that's the suicide prevention hotline number 24/7, 1-800-273-8255. And also our very own Integral Care, 512-472-HELP, 472-4357. And lastly, there is the text line. A lot of our young folks don't want to talk, but they feel comfortable texting, and that's a form of communication. That number, that text is 741-741. And we thank you again for your time. Thank you for allowing me, Elliot, to step into this space with you, and I appreciate you so much.